Hello, everyone, and welcome to this bonus episode of the Higher Ed Geek podcast. This is episode number 77 with Phil Oliff from the Pew Charitable Trusts. Really appreciate the team there reaching out to me to set up this conversation to process their recent report that examined state and federal spending on higher education and all the different nuances of that. So definitely a really timely conversation that I want to make sure I got out as soon as possible. We kind of deviate from our usual structure here, but I know that you'll really enjoy this kind of processing and exploration of the report. I'll link out to it down in the show notes in the description for the episode. So please do go check it out. It's a lot of great information. They pulled together a lot of information and really served it up in a way that I think is really easy for folks to understand. So please do sit back, relax, and enjoy this episode, a bonus episode of the podcast, number 77 with Phil Oliff. Yeah, if you want to just kick us off and give an introduction of yourself and your position, and guess that sort of and the relevance to this report that we'll be going over, and obviously we'll have linked in the show notes, but just give everyone a little context as to who you are and your kind of connection with this report.
Sure, happy to. So my name is Phil Oliff. I manage research at the Pew Charitable Trusts. And I also work on a team that focuses on policy connections between the federal government and the states, and also another team that does research on student loan repayment challenges and student loan issues. And my team put together this report on trends in federal and state funding for higher education and support for higher education. My career, a lot of my career really has been kind of at the intersection of tax and budget policy and finance and education policy. So it's kind of a logical step for me to be working on this report.
Very cool. Yeah, I mean, and it's an amazing report. I think that just really highlights our current moment very well in a way I think that's really sort of accessible and palatable people that they can, understand really well. Like when I was reading through it as not like a policy expert, it was, made a lot of sense to me, and I think is really would be helpful context for people all over the country. So just to give sort of an introduction to the report itself, I guess just give a snapshot of the report and like how it was developed. I don't know if this is something that you all have always done on a sort of regular basis, or if it sort of came about as sort of just important maybe to do now as sort of a new effort on your part. But yeah, just going to give a snapshot of the report and how it was developed.
Sure. So this report is really a big picture look at the landscape of federal and state support for higher education, the really dramatic changes that we've seen in that landscape over the last couple of decades, and the big differences in the levels of federal and state funding across states. There are really critical debates that are happening right now at both levels of government. So federal policymakers are considering potentially really major changes to the Higher Education Act, which governs federal financial aid programs and really is where a lot of the dollars are when we talk about federal funding for higher education. At the same time, state policymakers are considering major changes to their higher education funding in areas ranging from performance funding to free college. And the goal of our report really is to provide context for understanding these debates and how they fit within the larger system of federal and state support for higher education. Higher education is really an area where the federal government and the states both spend a lot of money. There is really very little formal coordination in terms of policy. So it's a bit of a unique area in that respect. Unlike in other areas like Medicaid or K through 12 education, where the federal dollars flow to state and local governments and there are matching and maintenance of effort requirements, you really see far fewer strings attached to higher education funding. But the federal government and the states do have overlapping policy goals in higher education, like college access and support for research. Mm-hmm. And so for that reason, we really thought it was important to try to clearly explain the big picture and how all these federal and state puzzle pieces fit together.
Right. Well, and I know too, like kind of an inciting moment that I think is kind of like the report kind of anchors on a little bit too is the Great Recession. I think was very disruptive in this sort of space. So I feel like was that a little bit of kind of like inspiration too to like sort of like kind of where are we now in relevance to kind of that moment in time, just in sort of recent memory.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad that you hit on the Great Recession because recessions are a really big deal for higher education funding. We don't know when the next recession is going to hit, but we are now deep into a very long economic expansion. There are some economists that are warning that a recession could hit sometime in the near future. And now is really a good time to start thinking about if a recession did hit, what would happen to higher education funding. Higher education is the area of state spending that tends to get hit the hardest when states face economic challenges, see the revenues drop, and need to make really hard decisions to balance their budgets. There are two key reasons experts cite for this. The first is that public colleges and universities have an alternative revenue source when they see their state funding cut, which is tuition. The second is that states have, in many ways, more discretion to cut higher education than they do for other areas of their budget. So going back to federal-state dynamics, in most other areas where the federal government and the states spend a lot of money, like Medicaid, you see matching or maintenance of effort requirements for states to spend their own money in order to draw down federal funds. But you see a lot less of that in higher education. Federal funding, by contrast, follows a really different pattern than state spending when it comes to recessions. And that's something that makes a lot of sense because states need to balance their budget, but the federal government does not. In fact, in the aftermath of the Great Recession, when states saw very significant declines in their spending on higher education, federal spending actually saw a fairly sizable increase. The biggest factor in that after the Great Recession was a surge in Pell Grant spending. There are a few different reasons for this. One was increasing financial needs on the parts of students. Another was an increase in enrollment, so more people going back to school to build job skills. But it was also related to policy changes that expanded eligibility for the program and increased award amounts. In addition to the Pell Grant spending growth, the federal government expanded veterans' educational benefits, made them more generous around the time of the onset of the recession with the enactment of the post-9/11 GI Bill. So that increase was also happening. And then beyond that, the federal government actually provided money to states to help try to minimize recession-driven cuts in education spending. So the federal government provided roughly $40 billion between 2009 and 2011 to states to bolster their K-12 and higher education spending. And to receive this funding, states needed to maintain their own education spending at a minimum of 2006 levels, and they ultimately spent about $8.3 billion of that money to help sustain their institutions of higher education. And then on top of all of these spending increases, the federal government also made a significant increase in their support for higher education through the tax code when what was then called the Hope Credit was expanded into what is now called the American Opportunity Tax Credit. So to sum all of this up, these federal increases were driven both by several factors: rising enrollment, increasing needs, but also policy choices. I think a major area of uncertainty in all of this is the kind of policy choices the federal government would make were we to face a recession in the near future. But what all of this points to is the importance of both levels of government really paying attention and thinking about what might happen to higher education funding if a recession were to hit.
Well, I think, with all that being said, with this sort of, kind of laying out the report and everything, and maybe it's something maybe you want to emphasize that you've already mentioned or anything else, like, what do you think would be like most surprising to people about this report? Like, it has a lot of information. It's comparing kind of like, state funding levels, like for each state individually, like anything like that, I guess, like anything that you think might be, surprising to people as they would start reading through this report.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think for me, there were a number of major surprises. So maybe the biggest surprise was what I see as the key message in the report, which is just how big a shift there has been in the relative levels of federal and state funding for higher education over about the last decade and a half, since the start of the millennium. Between 2000 and 2015, state funding per student adjusted for inflation fell by 30%, even as federal spending grew by about a quarter. And as a result of that, federal and state funding levels are really much more even now than they had been historically. To give some numbers to help to illustrate this, historically, states have far and away been the bigger spender on higher education. Back in 2000, state spending was basically double what federal spending was on a per student basis. But by 2015, that gap had shrunk to just 12%. So that's a pretty big shift in a pretty short period of time. Another key surprise is just how much variation there is in the levels of federal and state funding for higher education across states. I think one thing the report really illustrates is that in many ways we're dealing with 50 different state systems of higher education funding. So, for example, federal funding per student in 2017 was 3 times higher in Hawaii than it was in Missouri. And you see even bigger differences in state funding. State funding was nearly 5 times or as high in Connecticut as it was in Arizona in that year. At the federal level, these differences are driven by things like differences in students' financial needs, the kinds of research that's taking place within a state, and the number of veterans that are attending school within a state. At the state level, it's driven by differences in policy choices and philosophies about how higher education should be funded. Another thing that really leaps out as a surprise from this report is just how big tax expenditures, tax benefits for higher education are in the scope of overall higher education funding and support for higher education. At the federal level in 2017, overall tax expenditures, including things like the American Opportunity Tax Credit, totaled $41 billion. If you put aside loans, that's the single largest form of federal support for higher education. It's bigger than the Pell Grant. It's bigger than veterans' educational benefits. It is bigger than research funding. We also found, we at the Pew Charitable Trusts have also found that higher education tax benefits are very widespread at the state level. So in a report that we wrote, we found that all 41 states and DC with a broad-based income tax provide some form of support through their income taxes to help support higher education. So it's a very important piece of the overall puzzle. And then the final thing that I will point out as a surprise, and one thing that really struck me, was the scale of veterans' educational benefits in the overall system. One statistic from this report that really leaps out when I look at it is that in 2017, the federal government spent more on veterans' educational benefits than all of the states combined spent on their financial aid grants. So it's a very big piece of the puzzle that I think oftentimes gets set aside, or it's not always understood quite how big it is on the overall scale of support for higher education.
Yeah, that's a good, just kind of comparative measure there. Well, and I guess, as much as is in this report, there's a lot of great information. Do you feel like, and maybe because it could be hard to track, is there anything that kind of gets left out of this conversation? Because I feel like, veteran funding would be maybe one of those things, or just how you could maybe parse out the information and maybe make it a little bit more focused or something. I'm not sure. Maybe, just what kind of sticks out to you now that you kind of have compiled all this information? Anything that you feel like maybe gets left out of the conversation, or is hard to track. So I feel like that may be kind of causal, it's left out because it's hard to track, or those could be two kind of separate things. But I guess what are your thoughts on that?
Sure. I mean, we talked a minute ago about just how big a footprint higher education tax benefits have in the overall system of support for higher education. But as big as they are, higher education, this tax support for higher education often gets left out of overall debates about the scale and nature of higher education spending. And there are a number of reasons for that. The first is that these tax expenditures often aren't subject to the same kind of recurring budget procedures as our most spending programs for higher education, which get debated regularly through the appropriations process. In many cases, these tax expenditures are permanent programs that very rarely get revisited after they get put in place. The second reason is that tax and spending programs at the federal level, and in some cases in state legislatures, fall under the jurisdiction of different committees. So, for example, in the U.S. House, spending programs like the Pell Grant fall under the jurisdiction of the Education and Labor Committee, whereas the tax programs like the American Opportunity Tax Credit fall under the jurisdiction of the House Ways and Means Committee. And for that reason, it is difficult to have a completely coherent and comprehensive discussion about support for higher education that takes into account both spending and tax benefits. And the third reason is that states rarely compile comprehensive information about how much their higher education tax benefits are costing, making it even less likely that these tax provisions will come up in debates over or get incorporated into debates over support for higher education at the state level. We at the Pew Charitable Trusts found that of the 41 states and DC that provide higher education tax benefits through their income taxes, only 9 of those states and DC have even reasonably comprehensive estimates of their costs. So we know that states are providing support for these tax benefits, but there's a lot of missing information in terms of how much they're providing and where it fits into the broader system of support for higher ed.
Which I guess it's just fascinating to, it's like, yeah, you said that like they sort of put something in place and maybe just like set it and forget it. And it's just like, do you know how much that you're spending on this, or how much is, I don't know, like how much it's being utilized or something? And because, they could be like, oh, wow, this is like, really popular. That's great. Or it's like, oh, wow, it's actually not even being utilized as much as we, thought it should be or could be. So, yeah, it's just fascinating because I think it's just one of those times where it's kind of like, I guess I don't even know the word. Like, I want to say like humbling or something where it's just like, you know what, even like, different governments and stuff are kind of not organizing things in like the best way, It's like, I'll give myself a little bit of a break. But you did mention this earlier that, we're kind of due for a recession in the near future, when and how severe that might be, it's anyone's guess. But, that is what sort of seems to be likely in this current moment. So if you want to emphasize, I guess, sort of like, I guess not making any one single prediction, but like, what do you feel like could be kind of the possibilities from what this report would be telling you from, the prior Great Recession? Like, what sort of impact do you think, this data would tell us we may be seeing, in the near future here?
It's really critical for policymakers now, even as the economy continues to hum along and to grow, to be thinking about what might happen in a recession related to higher education funding. Higher education spending tends to be the area of state funding that's really most vulnerable to cuts when recessions hit. That's what history teaches us. And then at the federal level, and I've emphasized this a bit earlier, the pattern is very different. Oftentimes you see higher education funding going up when recessions hit. So they tend to, the state and the federal spending tend to follow very different patterns. And what that means is that the policymakers at the two different levels really should be conscious of what might happen to higher education funding should a recession hit. But they kind of have different considerations to think about. It's also important, I think one thing this points to is the importance of thinking about the higher education funding system as a whole, because these different funding streams follow different patterns. It's important not just to kind of think about what one level or the other is doing, but to think about how the two interact and the overall impact on being able to achieve kind of the shared policy goals of the federal government and the states, the common policy goals of those two levels of government.
Well, and I think so that kind of leads, I think, well into kind of our final question here of like, what are things for people to think about after reading this report? Certainly, like this is 2020, major election year, in terms of just like really trying to, read through this report, process the information, and hopefully, kind of inform any sort of, the people that they're voting for, or just things that they're supporting, like any of those sort of things. So what would you hope people can kind of take away and think about after reading this report?
Yeah, so one major one is something I mentioned a moment ago, which is the importance of thinking about the higher education funding system as a whole and not thinking about federal and state funding in silos. I think it's a presidential election year, so there may be a lot of kind of focus on federal policy, but it's really critical to think about how things like federal and state funding, tax expenditures, and loans fit together to make sure that both levels of government are using their higher education resources as effectively and efficiently as possible to achieve their higher education policy goals. A second thing is that it is really critical to think about what these shifting levels of federal and state higher education funding mean for students and institutions and the ability of policymakers at both levels of government to achieve their higher education goals. And that's because the shift in federal and state higher education funding is not just a shift in terms of which level of government is paying for higher education, but in the way that those dollars flow into the higher education system, because the two levels of government have very different funding models. The federal government, the biggest part of that federal money goes to support individual students and research projects at a broad range of institutions, both public and private. State funding is very different. The largest share of state funding goes to provide general support specifically to public institutions. And so decline in state spending and the increase in federal spending is really in many ways a shift away from providing general support for institutions and more towards providing support for individual students. So I think it's really critical for people to be thinking about what the implications of that are and what that might do to our ability to achieve the policy goals that we want, that folks want to accomplish. And then I think the final piece to keep in mind is the gap that you highlighted, in information and that I mentioned was that more states really should consider assessing the costs of their higher education tax expenditures. These are benefits that often fly under the radar to begin with, and then on top of that, we don't even know what they're costing. So policymakers in this case really don't have all of the information they would need to fully understand their state's support for higher education and how well it's being used and how efficiently it's being used to try to achieve the goals they're trying to accomplish.
I think you're saying, I guess it's not wholly like maybe like better or worse one way or the other, or like that there's one or only way to have the funding kind of flowing into higher education. But to me, I'm like, worried if it's like leaning kind of too much one way or the other in terms of like going towards, students at the cost of institution. Cause it's like, well, institutions need to have like, or they should, I think, have funding so that they can have robust budgets to provide all the kind of support services and engagement opportunities and like, just be able to recruit great people to work at that institution. But then also it's like, well, it also wants students to be able to have funding. So, there's like need-based funding, and other things and tax credits, they should be also supported to sort of mitigate or cover the cost of their attendance at any institution. So like, to me, in a perfect world, like both of those things would be, kind of robust and healthy and flowing, funding sources. But yeah, it's just interesting that it seems to be, going in a very different way. And like you said, that it may be just like, they're both, I would think, aiming towards the same outcome, but working like kind of independently and blind of one another, essentially. I guess, like, do you feel like that's kind of like, I guess an accurate kind of like, sort of depiction of where we're at? Is, I guess maybe the concern would be that like institutions wouldn't have perhaps as like stable or secure of a budget if they're like now relying more so on tuition. So then like it could end up being where, yeah, I mean, students are getting support, but the institutions aren't able to, give them as many resources once they actually like, start attending classes and everything.
Yeah, so I think you've hit on something really important that really is at the heart of this report, which is that the report hopefully gives some building blocks for thinking systematically about how all of these different funding streams fit together and what the bigger picture looks like across levels of government. It's trying to take discussions out of silos, both across the federal and state level, but also in terms of different categories of spending, like tax expenditures, loans, and direct spending like the Pell Grant, and put it together in a larger picture so that people can start to think about kind of trade-offs and think about how all of these different funding streams might build on each other or not to help get them towards the policy goals they're trying to achieve. So the hope is, this report is really a first step. So when folks are talking about different potential policy changes or thinking about whether their current funding streams fit with their goals, that they can use this to walk in a systematic way through the system as it is and kind of think about what we might want to change or adjust or just kind of understand where we are in terms of current policy.
Very good. Well, thank you so much for, putting this report together, but also, jumping on to kind of help talk everyone through it and process it and everything. And, because I think, again, this is just like such a great resource to help inform, kind of anybody and everybody in higher education to just have a better understanding of our current moment and the context we're in. So, really appreciate your time and all that you've shared.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me on.
This podcast is part of the ConnectEDU Podcast Network, bringing together diverse voices in the higher ed community. Check us out on Twitter at ConnectEDUPod or at connectedu.network. Thanks for listening to this episode of the podcast. Make sure to rate, review, and subscribe so you never miss an episode. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode of the Higher Ed Geek Podcast.